Welcome back, artists. I'm Wyatt Paints, and today I'm starting a first diorama for the channel with the first family of Marvel, the Fantastic Four. For the first volume, I'm going to be covering painting the base and that lovable blue-eyed thing, Ben Grimm. Now, a personal goal for this diorama is for it to be 99% airbrush free. I'll need to use it for a few effects on Sue and Johnny's store, but outside of that, it's going to be 100% brush with a focus on basic techniques to get amazing results. Ever since I printed this out a few weeks ago, I have been hyped about the idea of bringing one of my favorite teams to life. So I'm going to get right to it. I'm going to head over to my spray booth. Let's get started. All good paint jobs tend to start with a good foundation of primer. This preps the surface so that your paint can adhere better to your model. But keep in mind, you don't really need a fully opaque coat of primer, but more of a general dusting. Because of its self-leveling properties, if you spray too heavy of a primer coat, you risk filling in the finer details of the surface. Thankfully, that wasn't something I was too concerned over with this model, as the details are pretty well defined. I was more focused on ensuring the deeper recesses were blacked out. This will help give the shadows and detail lines a bit more definition. The only real choice I made here was the base, the plinth in gloss primer, and everything else in flat primer, both from Rust-Oleum. Speaking of the plinth, there was not much going on with it other than being a big metallic platter everything sits on, so I painted it with a metallic finish. Honestly, I wasn't too excited to paint this at all, and I figured this would be the best way to handle it, and since silver is very often swapped in for the white in the Foursomes logo, I figured the metallic finish would be good enough. Although it wouldn't be my last issue with this model, it was a relatively minor one, as it has to sit on something, so it might as well be this. Once it was shining enough, I set it aside for more pressing matters. Like painting the base, starting with espresso craft paint. I was gifted these paints from one of my patrons, and they are certainly an economical way of painting large surfaces, especially if more details will be painted later. While I wouldn't use this for the finer details, it is a workhorse for just laying down color cheaply. I don't think I'll ever want to use my expensive model paint for this kind of work again. And with the range of colors that came with them, I'm sure they can handle whatever basing need I may come across. After a few coats, I switched to stone gray for the rocks. I realized I could have just painted the whole slab of gray stone, but I wanted to have a contrast of gray stone and the brown earth. This adds a bit of an action dynamic, as if the team had landed here with such a presence that they made their own crater. When covering the rocks, I took less care with getting a full coverage like I did with the ground earlier. When dealing with natural surfaces such as rocks, it's okay to leave a bit of the primer showing through, as it adds to the surface variation that'll make it look more naturally formed. So don't be afraid to leave a spot here and there of the bare black primer. Just try to reserve it for the pits and deeper cracks, and it should turn out fine. After a quick ramen lunch to let everything dry, I came back in with Nuln Oil to shade the rocks. This was an all-over wash using a makeup brush. I find this type of brush is perfect for large wash jobs. Not only does it hold a lot more shade than your typical brush, it also performs better as a mop, picking up the excess shade to spread elsewhere. One extra tip for solid wash jobs is to wash in one direction and keep a live edge. This means not letting the leading edge of the wash dry by moving quickly. Once an area starts to dry, you'll want to avoid it, or you'll start to layer the shade, and this will end up looking like a coffee stain. While some amount of this staining can be addressed in a future step, it's best to follow good standards of practice so that you minimize touch-ups and repaints. Next up, sterling mud. Since the rocks and the dirt have very similar surface texture, I wanted to break them up by adding a bit of extra fine grit to the dirt. In this application, a little bit goes a long way to changing the look of the surface, so I kept this sparse and random across the already brown area. This actually pulled double duty by adding a bit of tone variation to the dirt as well. Just be sure not to paint this over any of the footholds for the models. Doing so may alter the fit and make securing them difficult later. Next, I did some shading with sepia. This is not a very dark shade to use over this already very dark brown, so it was more to act like a filter and hide some of the hard edges from the sterling mud. So just a quick stippling of this wash was applied and left to dry. tan craft paint was picked for the final highlight. I used this as a light dry brush so that it would not only define the details of the dark earth, but also pick out the sandy texture that I added with the sterling mud. While you can get away with a bit of a heavy hand here, don't get too carried away, as it'll start to look like desert sand. In fact, I do end up adding a bit more sepia shade on top, but for now it was fine, and I wanted to finish up the rocks. For that, I grabbed mountain stone. Here, the main goal is to lighten up the overall hue of the stone. Doing it in a medium strength dry brush lets me maintain some of the extra shadows that came from the wash, and also feathers the edge from the wash to the midtone. Just know, skipping this step can result in a muddy and drab look. One area that is easily overlooked is the underside of these rocks. Thankfully, these will be in shadow and not really draw attention, but you'll want to give it at least a once over just so that it's not too dark and fits in with the rest of the diorama. As a final highlight, Starship Exterior. Here I'm using a very light dry brush to only pick out the peaks and sharpest edges of the rocks. This extra step of contrast, in my opinion, really gives the rocks a very violent characteristic. Either they're gonna do some damage or it took some damage to make them. It's a good idea to be very reserved with this step, as it may be tempting to overdo it and highlight every detail. But if you keep this to just the peaks, it'll subtly add a bit of extra depth to the base, making the rocks look a little bit taller, which in turn will make the entire project look a little bit bigger than it normally would. With the base pretty much finished, I assembled it over on the spinning platform. Here's where I felt the dirt could use just a bit more shading, as it was looking a bit too close in brightness of highlights, so I gave it a quick once over with sepia and called it done. Before I move on to painting Ben Grimm, I'd like to take a moment to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. This week with your support, I was able to burn my face off with some fire ramen. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you'll find a link to my Patreon in the description below. And lastly, if you're enjoying the content, be sure to like and subscribe. We just passed 1,100 strong in the painting pantheon, and each viewer just like you that joins reassures me that people enjoy the content that I'm putting out. Hopefully we can smash through 1,200 strong in no time. But for now, it's clobbering time. I can't do voices well. I can't do that voice. Since I still had it out, I decided to use the Espresso craft paint to base Ben. It dries to an extra matte finish, which will really lend to giving him a dusty, rocky look, while the heavy overbrush puts the base coat down fairly fast. It's important to ensure that all the cracks are adequately painted. It took about 3 coats before I got the saturation I was happy with. Infernal Orange will be giving me Mr. Grimm's signature color. Once again, a dry brush was used to slowly tint up the rock surfaces. Thankfully, since Ben has such a textured surface, a dry brush is an easy choice on how to tackle it. The most important thing here is to exercise good paint and brush control. I would rather put very little paint on the model and have to reload more often than hitting the model with too wet of a brush. My method for this is first only prepping a standard brush load's worth. Loading too much at one time will make it very hard to get the brush to behave. I load up the makeup brush by doing circles and twisting my grip on the brush every few spins. This way I can ensure that the paint is evenly spread. Then I check the bristles of the brush. If it looks like spiky gelled hair, then it's too wet and will need some brushing on the texture palette. But if it's nice and fluffy with little to no spikiness, it should be good to go. This way, I get a nice slow application of the orange highlight. The slower this goes, the easier it'll be to get each section to match. Also, it helps to hold the connecting pieces in place to make sure the intensity matches. And also, thankfully with his rocky texture, any seam lines we leave here will blend in perfectly. Once everything was sufficiently orange, I grabbed this midnight blue to base the shorts. Now it's important to paint clean from here on out, so extra care must be made around the edges to keep from overpainting. because unfortunately getting any blue on the orange will show up like a sore thumb. So go slow, brace your arms, and focus on how good it's going to look when you're done investing the time it needs. For the first highlight, Magic Blue. To add this, I use a stiff stipple technique. After drying a brush, similar to a dry brush but just slightly wetter, you can stipple by lightly tapping the brush onto the surface like you're using a stamp. Just be careful to go straight down and right back up. Any lateral movement will leave a brush stroke that will mar the effect we're going for. As an extra tip, always start the first few taps after reloading in an area you want the most highlight. This will give you a little bit of a safety net, just in case you left a bit too much paint on. Once you get in a good rhythm and a good feel of how the paint is coming off the brush, you can naturally speed up your tap rate to start feathering the color towards the darker areas. I repeated this all across the larger areas where it seemed like the fabric was being stretched. The final highlight for the shorts is Void Shield Blue. I applied a soft dry brush using this small makeup brush. First by checking how fluffy my brush is, and then highlighting all the seams on the shorts. Once those were bright, I added a little bit here and there across the stretched areas to show extra stress on the fabric. It's a good idea to keep your strokes perpendicular to the grain of the fabric. This way it'll pick up all the details without an issue. With the shorts done, I grabbed crimson to start working on the mouth. Unfortunately, getting light down the mouth and an angle the camera can see proved rather difficult, so you'll have to bear with me and trust that I'm just generally getting the base red across the inside of the mouth. Nothing too complicated here. If you can see it, paint it the best you can. Any areas you may have difficulty painting will just fade to black anyways. Scarlet is the first highlight for the mouth. Now, there isn't too much to highlight here besides giving a bit of brightness to his tongue and picking out some of the ribbing on the roof of his mouth. Bloody Red was a fitting final highlight for his tongue. Be sure to take it easy here, or you risk making him look like he's bleeding from the mouth. While it would be a cool addition as battle damage, I think it would be a bad fit for the sculpture. So a light hand is best. Just a few dabs here and there before moving on. Next, Menthol White, the base of the teeth. This is a solid go-to light bone color as a starting shade for most teeth. It's easily shaded with light tone or sepia for a grungy look, or in this case, brighten up with a touch of Starship exterior. This highlight was focused on the center and towards the tip of each tooth. As with most heroes I paint, if their teeth are showing, I make it a point to show that they have solid oral hygiene. While the Thing has rock-like skin, his teeth are always pearly. Heck, I remember having a Thing toothbrush growing up, so that's reason enough to do Ben right here. I followed this by blocking out his eye with the same light gray. I then used a watered-down flesh wash to give it a slight bit of color, before re-highlighting the center mass with pure white. Then using a couple of brushes, I maneuvered into place some decals I picked up from Evolution X on Etsy. While it does take some practice and patience to nudge the decals in place, it gets you a fantastic result in very little time, especially once you get the hang of it. Once I liked the look, I locked them down and hit the edge with a bit of decal fix. Finally, the belt was the last detail to handle. After basing it black to black, I grabbed the uniform gray to stipple in a first level of highlight in the center of the elbow. Just like before, soft repeated taps up and down of a semi-dry brush will leave you with a soft glow in the belt. I took this one step further with Starship exterior, again in a stipple, but this time with a smaller brush and a smaller pattern in the center. I kept this up until the glow just popped, And as a bonus of using the stipple technique, it keeps the sides of the embossed 4 fairly clean. In this next step, I'll be adding the iconic blue on the top surface of the 4 and the surrounding circle. Using an edge highlighting technique will make quick work of this. All you have to do is to remember to use the belly of the brush, not the tip. So long as you don't overload your brush with paint, this will be a pretty easy way to control the application. Before it felt done, I gave the ribbing of the belt a once over to really tie everything together. As a final piece for the base, the Fantastic Four emblem itself. I had already primed this with the same metallic finish I used on the platter, and just like the belt, use edge highlighting to paint the raised detail to increase readability and sort of be the color key I'm going to be using as the main color for the suits across the entire family. After this, I glued up Ben and called him done. Wow, he came out amazing. At least I think so. And it just goes to show, using the most basic techniques, you can tackle large statues and get professional results. Be sure to let me know what you think about this one in the comments below. I love reading everybody's feedback. Now, Benjamin is only 1/4 of this famous family. Be sure to tune in next week for volume 2. Anybody got any guesses who's it gonna be? Maybe you're right. I mean, it's 1 out of 3, 33% chance to be right. Until next week, I'll leave you as always. Thanks for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.